Well, as Episode 1 took over the fandom of Star Wars, those of us that were original trilogy fans, well, actually, most of us were on board because at that time we hadn't seen Episode 1 and we didn't know how Jar Jar-rific it was going to be. And when the figures launched at Toys R Us's Midnight Madness, well, it was madness. People were grabbing figures like it was the last food cargo going to Rwanda. Actually, they have some interesting videos online where you can see cross-cutting between handing out food supplies to Rwandan refugees and people grabbing Darth Mauls. All right, but the point being, while there was so much hype around Episode 1, the original trilogy dried up. There was very little released that year. But the few figures that did come out, and there were some significant ones, tended to all really be nice gems. And, well, a big part of that is because the classic trilogy was being used as a marketing tool in order to promote Episode 1. And even before Episode 1 had a name, Phantom Menace, they were already using Episode 1 on these flashback figures. You can see, if you want to go back a couple episodes, the video highlighting that. Needless to say, the flashback figures were really amazing updates of the original trilogy's main cast. A lot of figures we hadn't had on shelf for 2, 3, 4 years. And we got some other cool surprise figures too, like Anakin Skywalker, if he was actually alive, because that's not a ghost of Anakin, I don't know. But yeah, it was all about linking Episode 1, see, there you see it on package without Phantom Menace, because that word didn't exist yet, and Darth Vader. And that's the whole point of a flashback photo. I mean, the figure doesn't become Anakin, I guess it does in your imagination, but at least the photo does. So yeah, it was a great time to get the main characters. Background characters, not so much, because the focus was going to be on the new content, and it made sense. This seemed like it was a gold mine, and it was a sure thing. And in order to justify the price increase to $6.99, all of the Episode 1 figures got a ComTech chip, which allowed you to hear the voice of your favorite or least favorite Star Wars characters. And in order to enjoy the full effect of the ComTech chip, unfortunately, you had to buy a second toy. They didn't just work with a push button, which a lot of parents were expecting because they were called, hey, now your figures talk. Needless to say, they didn't talk unless you made a secondary purchase. And this didn't go over too well with too many parents. I mean, obviously, some kids loved it. I bought one. I still don't know where it happened to it. I haven't used it in years, if I even have it. But yeah, it was an interesting idea. And in order to keep classic trilogy figures going, several waves of figures were packaged with the ComTech branding and ComTech price increase. So therefore you had an Episode 1 line, and you had Power of the Force carrying on with the classic trilogy with the idea that it would give you double the amount of retail space. Now, the idea was originally to continue with two split lines like this, with ComTech 2.0 set to take over, and original trilogy figures continuing to ship on Power of the Force cards, where you would get even deeper into the character selection as Episode 1 sort of faded into the background. But it wasn't going to be a total miss for your Episode 1 fans, because the idea was that line would have continued also with the ComTech 2.0 Twice the Speech feature. And essentially all of the figures that were planned for the Twice the Speech line, both for Episode 1 branding and for Power of the Force 2 branding, which was the classic trilogy, well, while these figures lost their ComTech 2.0 inclusion, simply because, well, we'll get into why ComTech wasn't the hugest hit, but these figures did wind up getting released. They just got combined into one line, which became Power of the Jedi, which is why you see a few of these early Power of the Jedi figures showing up on the cross-sell for the final Power of the Force 2 figures. And we're going to get more into that actually in an episode or two to talk about this. So sit back. It'll be a while, but there's only like 2 or 3 more Power of the Force 2 videos before we get into that whole change. And it's a fascinating story. All right, so back to ComTechs. So yes, we all have that basket somewhere, right, of all of these little clear iridescent squares, rectangles, right? Yep, well, actually it has rounded edges. I don't know what shape that is, but you can see a picture of a figure and usually a small typo description on the back. Yeah, check them out. There's a lot of typos on those things. And this final wave of single-carded ComTech figures actually gave us some really great figures, and we'll start it off with a pairing here of R2-D2 with Princess Leia, because, hey, it's a 2-pack, right? You get R2 and you get Leia. Okay, granted, she's an accessory and a hologram, but this is really one of the only times outside of, well, I guess there was that Obi-Wan figure in that box set. Never mind, okay, it's one of 3 times that we've gotten a small hologram figure of Leia. Now, doing hologram figures are a little tricky. Most of the time, we wind up getting a figure cast in all blue or sort of light purple iridescent plastic, like case in point this San Diego Comic-Con quote-unquote hologram Leia, which was the Power of the Force 2 second pass Leia that was just done in clear plastic. Or maybe even a better example, this gentle giant maquette, which again, made of just blue clear plastic. And yeah, I mean, it always kind of bothered me because in the movie you could see skin color. It wasn't just all blue. I really applaud a few of the attempts to do this, like with that Sidious figure or this upcoming Luke Skywalker Jabba Palace hologram. But for now, our hologram was going to be that blue raspberry popsicle color, non-painted, but it did have some sparkle to it. R2 himself actually got a bit of a facelift. Besides the fact that we'd had quite a few R2s in Power of the Force 2, we hadn't quite gotten this version. Well, sort of. I mean, we'd had different attempts at different R2s. We recently had the most attempted one with that giant third leg from the Flashback. But to do the recreation of this scene, we got an R2 that had the restraining bolt actually tooled as part of his body. And thank you to Galactic Hunter for letting me borrow these images. It's another great repository of fantastic Star Wars photos. Now, there would be later figures that would also have the restraining bolt, even though this figure actually represents him before he got the bolt put on. But yeah, it was pretty cool. But what made this figure stand out, though, was the fact that nobody could find it. How does someone have 4 of these? This figure was so hard to find. It was 1 per case. And it just, I don't think any figure in the entire line drove me as batty. This was the holy grail of figures, if you could find it. And the one time I found this wave on shelf, I remember it was the Tustin Toys R Us in Tustin, California, and they had 1 Vader and 2 Stormtroopers and no R2. It was the only time I ever saw this wave, and that was it. Now, what of course made a hard-to-find figure even more frustrating was there was a variant. There was a different peg that attached the leg. First it was circular, then it was corrected to the half moon. So, hey, congratulations if you have the circle one. I mean, you could still pick this figure up for about $20 on the aftermarket, but man, at the time, so hard to find. Well, like a good red wine and a box of Captain Crunch, things do pair well, and with our R2-D2, we got our Princess Leia captured in the exact moment that she puts a CD-DVD into his drive. Now, getting a new Princess Leia for A New Hope is definitely something that was needed after all that first attempt. The less said about it, the better. And the second attempt was a really nice figure. Granted, it took, 2-3 years to get out, which is the normal toy development cycle. And then we had the ceremonial Leia, which is, still A New Hope, but slightly different outfit and, obviously different hairstyle. So this was back to buns on the head, and this was actually hood up, which at this point we'd never had before. Even the old retro, vintage, whatever you want to call it, original Kenner figure. So yeah, getting a hood up Leia, very cool. Now granted, we got a better hood up Leia years later in a tin set, and this is the one that wound up on my wedding cake topper because it was just the perfect, bride Leia. But yeah, getting a hood up, very cool, and I'm glad they put that one out. Stormtrooper, wow. Okay, this one is actually kind of crazy because obviously Stormtroopers are, A-list villains in Star Wars. Basically, Darth Vader and Stormtroopers are the ones that most people who are not, super nerds remember. Now, don't make me show you this Leia again because we've already established that the early figures had to be redone. But surprisingly, the Stormtrooper never redone in Power of the Force 2 until now. While there had obviously been regular Stormtroopers, and we got the same Stormtrooper reissued on a green card, and then a green card with a freeze frame slide, because, again, we've established how much children love playing with slides. And then, of course, the deluxe version, which had some dirt spray masked on, as well as a giant crowd control claw thing. And the same more or less basic tool was modified for the Sand Trooper, and then plop on a Luke head, straighten the arms, and suddenly you have Luke. And even the original Kenner Stormtrooper, I know I may get, booed for saying this, but it's one of the worst figures. Its head didn't move. And for a trooper, a generic trooper, this was the only figure in the vintage line that didn't have head articulation. I mean, except for, the Gonk droid. So yeah, I know. It's sort of like the less you realize how bad we've had with Stormtroopers prior, the better. Surprising that we just never got a redo until this moment. But hey, yay that Hasbro stepped up and is... While today we can get Stormtroopers literally by the order full, and, you can get really, really good, highly articulated Stormtroopers, at the time, this was pretty unheard of. And this new ComTech Stormtrooper you can see on the left, and thank you to Bantha Skull for another great photo archive site. You can see what a step up, but still you got room for improvement, and there was all the way through the vintage collection. But at the time, this was really revolutionary because we finally had a Stormtrooper that looked more or less screen accurate, and he had blaster deco that showed up with, hot water? Yeah, the old hot water hidden paint feature. And, they had to make it seem different, especially for parents who may have already bought a Stormtrooper for their kids. All right, what would a Stormtrooper be without their favorite underling? And that, of course, is Darth Vader, the Darth Lord of the Seek. It's not Seek. I know it's Sith. I'm kidding. I said he was an underling to Stormtroopers. You really think I'm being serious about all this? All right, so there are multiple Darth Vaders for Power of the Force, and we had recently had this Flashback one, which actually was the A New Hope armor, surprisingly, because all of the other Vaders, well, except for the very first original 1978 one, but the ones from Power of the Force were in his Empire/Return of the Jedi armor, which is slightly different from that he wears in A New Hope, which is more, I guess, tunic, Jedi-esque, less armor, more cloth. So, which is odd because that's actually what he wears in the Obi-Wan show. But then I guess by the time A New Hope comes along, he removes that armor, and now he's got the cloth straps. And this was the first Vader we had with the whole hands-on hips pose, which was really cool because it's a very iconic Vader pose. And hey, he came with the torture droid, so he could torture the heck out of his daughter that he couldn't tell was his daughter because, the Force. Now, it was also great because, every other Vader lightsaber poses, whether you were holding your arm in the air or out to the side. Now we had a Vader had no lightsaber and just could hold his hands on something. In fact, this might be one of the only Vaders ever released without a lightsaber. That's kind of crazy if you think about it. But it was really cool to get the Imperial, Dr. Ball figure from Robot Chicken. And then, of course, we saw this tool show up quite a few times with some modification. Because, hey, when you've got Vader with his arms on his hips, you might as well use it. Because at least it looks different. And that was what was cool, because this was different from a lot of previous Vaders, and especially because it had a cloth cape, which was a first in the new line. Well, let me think. Yeah, no, the TIE Fighter pilot, the TIE pilot had a cloth cape, so nix that, but the first single-carded version. All right, wrapping up our single-carded ComTech figures that were sold at retail. Well, this one was barely sold at retail. Admiral Motti, probably at the time, and I remember Toy Fair magazine even said they were scraping the bottom of the barrel, although 20 years later, and we look at, how many figures we've gotten since then. But yeah, this was pretty much the most obscure figure, I think. It was a random Imperial. Well, it was the Imperial from A New Hope that gets choked by Vader and establishes that the Force can be used to, choke people. Now, it's not as widely known that Motti was also a huge fan of multicolored tennis balls. But, for those who wanted another Imperial officer besides Tarkin, it was great. Well, Piet, too. Don't want to forget Piet. And this was a modified version of the established tooling. And there are people who are major Motti fans, obviously. So, hey, for those of you who love Motti, you could get him on a single card or a few years later reissued as part of the Death Star briefing room. Because what's more exciting than a briefing room? Kids love briefing rooms. It should be noted that Motti shipped a lot later than the other figures in this wave, and that's most noticeable by the cross-sell, where there you see that Chewbacca with the hologram chess Dejarik table. So it's not chess, it's Dejarik. Chess is not a Star Wars game. So kind of like, Sabak, not poker. So so this figure that was supposed to be the next one after Motti on a green card wound up being the first figure for Power of the Jedi when the brand changed direction and had new all movie, if you will, encompassing. So all movies under one banner. And again, we'll get to that very soon, because that's a whole story into itself. But yeah, Motti was tough to find. He barely shipped to retail. I remember getting him. I think he was the first figure I had to buy on eBay in the entire time, because I was in college, and, well, it was a lot harder to toy shop in college. I mean, there just weren't as many stores, and, you were busy studying. But
not over yet.
It is.
Because we still have a little bit of Power of the Force 2 to do until we get to Power of the Jedi. So stand back, relax, and wait a couple more days or half a week, and we'll return with the next Power of the Force 2 figure.